Let's talk about Nittel Nacht, the mysterious Jewish custom of not studying on the evening of December 25th, the holiday of many of our non-Jewish neighbors. The reason why I say mysterious custom is because there's very little known about it in comparison to other Minhag Yisrael, in comparison to other Jewish customs. The earliest knowledge we have of Nittel Nacht is actually, it dates back to, as far as we know, to the Rishonim. We know it's mentioned by the students of Rabbeinu Yoina as well as the Rashbam. It's mentioned by some of the Ashkenazic Rishonim, not the Sephardic Rishonim. The tradition did not exist in Sephardic communities, as we'll talk about later. Many of the poskim don't elaborate on Nittel Nacht because it's simply put, it's not PC. Not studying Torah because of the events that took place, and we'll talk about that soon, isn't the PC concept. So it was always just passed down orally. It wasn't written down until the Achreinim, until later. Chassam Sefer, the Chavas Yair, and more relatively recent Sfardim, past 200 years or so, maybe 300 years. What does the term Nittel mean? Have you ever thought about that? Nittel Nacht, the night of Nittel. What is Nittel? Nittel is, there's actually a debate about it. There's a number of opinions. It depends how you spell it. If you spell Nittel Nun Yud Tes Lamed, then it comes from the word Netilah, to be removed. It's the day that Oisei Ish Yeshko is removed from the world. If you spell Nittel with a Taf, Nun Yud Taf Lamed, it comes from the word Teila, hung. It's the day that Oisei Ish was hung, allegedly hung on a cross. Some say it's actually not a Hebrew word, it's a Roman word, Roman for born. It's the day that he allegedly was born. And that is the holiday December 25th, which they allegedly celebrate his birthday. It's kind of a bizarre thing that we're living in reaction, living our Judaism in reaction to a non-Jewish holiday that we don't even believe in. To the extent that we're compelled to not even study Torah, which is so central to Judaism. Rabbi Yonasan Eibschitz was actually challenged on this by a local priest in his age. The priest told him, it says in Pirkei Avos that the world stands on three things. That one of the three pillars of the world is Torah study. And you guys aren't studying Torah. So how is the world existing according to you, according to your religion, according to your belief system? And the Yavitz told them it's a Minhag Yisrael. Minhag Yisrael Torah. It's a Jewish custom. A Jewish custom is Torah. So by not learning, by fulfilling the Minhag Yisrael of not learning, that is the Torah. That is the learning. And we have several Gedolei Yisrael, interesting snippets of Gedolei Yisrael, what they said or what they did about not learning specifically on Nittel Nacht. So we have the Rebbe Rashab. We know that he had very little patience for people that couldn't hold back from learning for those 6 to 8 hours on Nittel Nacht. The Tzemach Tzedek, by the way, this is kind of the other side of the coin. The Tzemach Tzedek was once learning on Nittel Nacht. A chassid came to him and said, Rebbe, it's Nittel Nacht. How are you learning? He slams the Sefer shut and he looks at the person seriously and he says, why did you have to tell me? The Oyev Yisrael wouldn't sleep the entire Nittel Nacht. You know why? He would dream about Torah. He didn't want to even dream about Torah. Although, as we'll discuss soon, you're allowed to think Torah Nittel Nacht, so that's interesting. Maybe he was extra makbid, I don't know. Rabbi Avram Elimelech of Karlin would cover up his Sfarim. He didn't want to be tempted at all to learn. That's how hard it was for him. And we have the story of the Maharsha, one of the famous Mefarshim in the back of the Gemara. The Maharsha was once not learning on Nittel Nacht. He was catching up on paperwork or whatever he was doing. And mysteriously, the Sefer just falls off the shelf. He runs to go pick it up, puts it back on the shelf. He sits down, goes back to his business. The Sefer falls down again. Picks it back up. A third time, the Sefer falls, and this is just too weird. And he can't hold himself back. He opens up the Sefer. Just then, law enforcement barges in. And this was a Christian law enforcement who, I guess, took offense to the tradition of Nittel Nacht that we're not learning because it's their holiday. And they were trying to, I guess somebody informed on the Maharsha, and they were trying to bust him for not learning. And at that moment, they saw him, when they barged in, it's when he picked up the Sefer, he opened it, and they said, oh, that's interesting, he is learning. And they had no reason to arrest him or detain him or anything like that. What are the reasons for not learning? Why would you not learn on Nittel Nacht? What is our not learning or our learning going to accomplish? What is that going to impact? So there's a number of opinions amongst the Achreinim of why we don't learn on Nittel Nacht. I'll just share a couple of them. According to the Likutei Pardes, it was a historical, logistical issue. If Yidden were caught going to the Beis Medrash on that evening, when all the Goyim are celebrating their quote-unquote sacred holiday, they would have been bullied by the Goyim. It could have caused pogroms. Just simply wasn't safe. And having lights on in their homes simply wasn't safe. So you couldn't go to the Beis Medrash, you couldn't have the lights on, you couldn't learn. That explains why they didn't learn back then. It doesn't necessarily explain why we don't learn now. Which is why, by the way, according to many Litvische communities, they still learn on Nittel Nacht because they maintain that the reason, or the main reason, the historical reason, simply doesn't apply. But there are other explanations. You have the Korban Nesanel. The Korban Nesanel is one of the Mefarshim on the Rash in the back of the Gemara. The Korban Nesanel explains that it's kind of like an element of Avelus. One who is an Avel, especially during Shiva or an Oinen, doesn't learn. Just like on Tisha B'Av, we don't learn. Learning Torah brings Simcha, and this is the day that we refrain from that level of Simcha because of Oisei Ish. We're essentially mourning the destruction that it brought to Yiddishkeit. And this, in many ways, the destruction that it brought to the world, as the Rambam discusses at the end of Hilchos Mechamis. The Chassam Sofer has a different take on it. Rabbi Moshe Sofer of Pressburg from the 1800s. He explains, well, look at it this way. Learning is forbidden from Shkia, from sunset, until Chatzais, until midnight. Why? So the Goyim traditionally would celebrate their December 25th Eve parties at Chatzais, starting at Chatzais. So Yidden are learning at night as normal. You go to bed, you're sleeping. And while we're sleeping, other people are partying, and there's klippa being added to the world. There's negativity being added to the world. So the minhag became to go to sleep until Chatzais, and that way you can learn after Chatzais. So the whole purpose of not learning up until Chatzais is simply so you're compelled to learn after Chatzais. That's what the Chassam Sofer says. And that's why in the Chassam Sofer's yeshiva, they would literally go to sleep early, around Shkia or whatever, maybe after Ma'ariv, and they would wake up at Chatzais and continue learning that evening. There's the reason brought in Hayei Meim, also quoted from B'nai Yisachar, that learning also adds chayis to Klippa, adds energy and vitality to this negative energy that tends to hide God's presence, which is the falseness of what the holiday is celebrating. But there's another explanation as well from the Kedushas Tzion. He says learning is supposed to lead to action. And on this day, Yeshu HaNoitzri didn't act on what he learned. That's what we're reminded of on December 25th, that we have this Yid who was an incredible Talmud Chacham, yet didn't act on or believe in what he studied, and prioritized more the feel-good element of humanitarianism and Judaism, as opposed to actually acting on what Hashem wants and acting on the Torah. So on this day, we focus more on acting, not on the learning, and that's why we don't learn. It's to emphasize the importance of action. The Tiferes Shloima says that Queen Esther, she declared a fast day, right, when the Jews were in trouble. She did that specifically on Pesach. On the Seder night. There was no Seder that year. There was a fast day instead, which is quite bizarre. You got to imagine the tumult that created in heaven. So similarly, us not learning on this day, that's going to create a big tumult in heaven and create a big ruckus and kind of shake things up. And finally, we have the reason attributed by the Maggid of Mezrich. This is interesting. Chazal tells us, Ali pater adam chaveiroi el mitoich davar halacha. A person should only leave their friend with words of halacha. Right, before leaving somebody, end off with a word of Torah. But there's an alternate translation, says the Maggid. Ali pater adam mechaveiroi. A person shouldn't leave. Chaveiroi could mean friend, could also mean connection. Don't leave your connection with God. Always proactively think about how you can connect with Hashem, have a deveikus with Hashem, unless you're learning halacha. When you're learning halacha, you're learning Hashem's ratzon, and you don't have the headspace to think about Hashem and His ratzon, so you don't have to be focused on Hashem in that same way, although it is Hashem's Torah. He says, this day there's such a high intensity level of klippa, we can't afford to not think about Hashem, even if it's through Hashem's Torah. We have to think about Hashem directly, which practically daven an extra long Ma'ariv that night, I guess. I don't know. When is Nittel Nacht? When is it observed? This period of time in which we don't learn, when is it? So it starts at the evening. That's when most Goyim celebrate. It's the evening in which most Goyim celebrate. In America and most countries, it's December 25th. In other countries, I think they do like January 6th or 7th, so the Jews of that community would not learn in that. In other words, it does change based on location. It starts at Shkia, starts at sunset. It goes until Chatzais. It's only at night because that's when the darkness of Klippa is prevalent. Nittel is observed on Shabbos as well, even on a Friday night. So when Nittel Nacht fell out on Friday nights, by the way, the Rebbe Rashab, who would normally deliver a mimer Friday night, so he would make sure to do the mimer Shabbos morning that time instead. So what do you do about Shnai Mikra Vechatargum and stuff like that? You have to do that earlier. It's known that the Rebbe of Liske wanted to say Shnai Mikra Vechatargum Friday night when it was a Nittel Nacht. Thought perhaps it's like a gather of tefillah, it's not really learning in the same way, you're just reciting. But he fell asleep, and when he fell asleep, before he even got to say it, his candle blew out, and he took that as a sign that perhaps we shouldn't be saying Shnai Mikra V'echad Targum. Again, Sephardic communities don't observe Nittel Nacht, and they're part of the world. It was unheard of. I guess the minhag never happened there, and certainly many of the reasons for the minhag, the practical reasons, were not relevant in Sephardic communities. In Litvish communities, many Litvish communities, Nittel Nacht is not observed for reasons mentioned. The logistical reasons aren't relevant anymore, although the spiritual ones are. The Steiperler Gaon personally did not observe Nittel Nacht. He would learn on Nittel Nacht, but he would make sure to learn Baal Peh. He would make sure to learn by heart without Svarim. People didn't necessarily know he was learning, and he did that out of respect for the minhag. That was how he kind of reconciled to still be respectful for the minhag itself. What is included in learning on Nittel Nacht? How do you define learning? It's not just limited to halacha, to Gemara, to Chumash, to more classical things, but it includes learning Musar, it includes learning Chassidus, any types of any thing that's part of the whole gamut of Torah. You're not allowed to learn. You are allowed to think Torah, by the way. The Nitei Gavriel explains that you're allowed to think Torah before Birchas HaTorah. Before saying Birchas HaTorah in the morning, you're not supposed to utter words of Torah, but you're allowed to think words of Torah. So in Nittel Nacht also you're allowed to think words of Torah. He says that even according to the Gra maintains that you're not allowed to think words of Torah even before Birchas HaTorah, because Shemeya Ka'oine, and thinking is like speaking, has that element of speaking. He says still for Nittel Nacht it's not exactly the same, because the idea of being Ma'aseh Chayis and Klippos isn't going to apply to thinking. Malachim and things like that don't read minds, and he says that's fine. You are allowed to read Sipurei Tzadikim, stories of Tzadikim. You're allowed to read Jewish history. The Kashlitzer Rebbe used to learn Josephus on Nittel Nacht. But either way, a person certainly shouldn't be wasting time on Nittel Nacht. They should be productive. There was once a bacher who had a button missing from his jacket, and the Rebbe said, I don't know if the Rebbe spoke to him directly or sent Rabbi Chadikov to him, I don't remember exactly, but basically informed this bacher that it's, you're representing the Rebbe and you gotta look like a mensch. The bacher said he's waiting for Nittel Nacht to fix his button. He didn't want to be mevatel Talmud Torah. The Rebbe got a lot of nachas from that. It's known that the Chidushei Rim of Ger would prepare Shabbos toilet paper for the entire year on Nittel Nacht. Again, you could be productive. The Imrei Emes used to learn a new language on Nittel Nacht. Again, it's being productive. Even if you can't learn Torah, at least you can, you're not doing Dvarim B'Teilim and you're not wasting time, and you're doing something that can support Jewish life in some way, and if not indirectly. The Rebbe would catch up on his mail on Nittel Nacht, especially in the later years, as long as it wasn't Torah-related mail. Much of the Igros Kodesh is quite diverse, and the things that weren't directly Torah learning, the Rebbe would catch up to that. The Rebbe Rashab and the Frierdiker Rebbe used to play chess together, and the Rebbe explained that even though they're not learning and they're playing a game that requires a mind exercise, that is mind intensive. They're still exercising the mind, and that's going to support their learning indirectly later on. It's brought down in Sfarim that there's an old minhag to say Aleinu L'Shabeach specifically out loud on Nittel Nacht. The reason is Aleinu L'Shabeach is saying that Shehem Mishtachavim Lehevel V'Lardik, we're extolling God, we are the Jewish people, and while other people bow down to nothing and to vanity, we bow down to God, we bow down to nothing other than God. We conclude Aleinu with Va'al Kein Nakav Lecha Hashem Elokeinu. We hope for that day that Hashem is going to show us His glory, and Yakir Vidu Kol Yisrael, the whole world is going to experience the emes, is going to experience His glory. So we definitely emphasize that idea on Nittel Nacht. Freilich in Nittel, that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.